Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am incredibly excited to be back again for the WHA Symposium. It was an honor to get to speak last year and share a little bit of information about float therapy, and I'm excited to be able to bring that back again this year and to dive a little bit deeper into what it might look like to add floating to your existing business. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to talk about a whole lot of things, but most of it is going to be focused around like adding on to an existing business. Feel free at any point to drop questions in the chat window. You are more than welcome to do that, and I'll be watching and responding to those questions as they come in, or if I happen to miss anything, I'll try to do my best to get back and scan everything so that I can respond a little bit later. But let me get you set up here. Ooh, there we go. So first things first, my name is Kim Hannan, and I have spent a couple of decades now working in the marketing and training sectors. I left the corporate world about 5 or 6 years ago, and have been focusing on helping holistic wellness centers through my company called Mindful Solutions. We're a boutique agency that focuses on social media. We also provide animated videos using some of the characters that you're going to see here. And I also own a center myself. My husband and I own Sukino Float Center in Salt Cave. We're located in southern Indiana, and we have been open for about 4 years right now. And my entire life is surrounded by float therapy and dry salt therapy. I also am a member of the Float Research Collective, which is a new nonprofit organization that launched earlier this year. And our goal is to really focus on the research side of floating. I'll talk a little bit more about that later and what that looks like. I'm also the president currently of the Float Conference, which is another nonprofit organization. And we host annual conferences, typically in the summertime. So you have plenty of time to start planning to join us next year. Our conference for 2023 is going to be located in Louisville, Kentucky, which is about 15 to 20 minutes away from me. So I'm really excited to be bringing everybody into my hometown and to get to show them around my center. I am also a co-host on the Art of the Float podcast. It's a group of amazing float center owners. I love these guys to death. And I learned so much listening to this podcast before I opened. And eventually to be able to join the podcast and share what I've learned along the way has been a true joy for me. So first off, if you aren't familiar, I want to spend a couple of minutes for just talking about what is floating. So if you heard me speak last year, some of this information will be a little bit redundant, but I'm going to go into a little more detail this year. So floating actually just involves floating in a body of water. It is about 10 inches. It's skin temperature. And so the idea is that you keep it at about 93 to 94 degrees, sometimes maybe a little bit higher. But it shouldn't feel warm on the skin. It shouldn't feel cool for any means, but it's not like a hot tub where it's typically about 102, 104 degrees. The idea is neutral. And so you kind of lose touch with where your body ends and where the water begins. And that alone is a very, very powerful aspect of the float experience. What is even more amazing about it is the fact that we fill the tanks with about 800 to 1,400 pounds of pharmaceutical grade magnesium sulfate. That's Epsom salt. And so if you've ever taken an Epsom salt bath, you know the benefits. It can be wonderful for reducing inflammation, reducing pain, a lot of other great things, including it's really wonderful for your skin. Whenever you visit a commercial center, most places these days do allow you to choose to leave the lights on. Some will have controls inside the tank where you can, turn them on, turn them off, even sometimes changing the color. A lot will also allow you to choose whether or not you listen to music. It's a pretty cool experience. And so we don't use the term sensory deprivation as much anymore because you have the options to reduce your sensory input, but you also have options to be able to just control those. Some people aren't ready for quiet darkness, floating in water. That sounds really weird and scary to them. There's a lot of power, a lot of benefit to doing so, but there's also a lot of benefit to even leaving on lights and music and having a nice relaxing experience and getting some of the sort of different benefits out of that entire time that you're floating. Some tanks will also even have starry lights in the ceilings. There's a whole lot of different options that are out there now, but a lot of people report that when they float, they feel completely weightless. There's no pressure anywhere on the body. And it sort of feels like they're floating in outer space or floating on a cloud. So if you think about what it's like every day in life, there's always something touching you. There's always pressure somewhere on your body, whether it's your body and your bones just stacking up on themselves. a lot of different ways that your body is receiving input. And when you're floating, we kind of take away all of that. Typically, float sessions are between 60 and 90 minutes. Sometimes they're a little longer. Sometimes you can do back-to-back sessions. Some places, not many, but some will offer kind of an express option where it's about a 30-minute session. At my center, we do 75, so we kind of land in the middle. So some of the benefits of floating, there are many, many benefits to floating. And athletic recovery is a huge one. A lot of professional athletic organizations in the NFL, the NHL, all of the sports teams, a lot of colleges have even started putting in float tanks into their training facilities. So it's not just something commercial anymore. It's not just something that is, kind of a woo-woo or fringe thing. There are so many benefits to floating that organizations are starting to recognize this. Some Army and military groups have also started implementing float therapy, whether it's through contracts with float centers or having their own facilities in their centers. On their own property. It is amazing for stress relief, great for pain relief and inflammation reduction, wonderful for increasing creativity. It's a very powerful place for meditation because you're not getting distracted. And there's a ton of research now coming out about how beneficial float therapy can be for those who are dealing with anxiety or depression. Some people use it if they are seeking higher states of consciousness, spiritual benefits, prayer, those sorts of things. It also can help to improve sleep and so much more. The big three that the Float Research Collective has really started promoting is that floating is an effective treatment for anxiety, stress, and pain reduction. And so that is typically what most commercial centers will see. So if you think about what you're offering to your guests already and the services that you're offering, if people are already coming to see you for any of those reasons, it just makes sense to be able to offer them an additional option in float therapy. If you want to get into the research side of things, I highly recommend going to clinicalfloat.org. This is where it's basically the home of the Float Research Collective, our nonprofit organization. But pretty much every single study that has to do with float therapy about, floating and reducing hypertension, floating with anxiety, chronic pain, all of the research is posted on Clinical Float. You'll also find presentations that are on there, mostly from Dr. Justin Feinstein, who is the president of the Float Research Collective, but also from folks at the Laureate Institute for Brain Research and lots of other publications around float therapy are there. One of the big things that the Float Research Collective is doing this year is really exciting. We are currently raising funds to start studies doing head-to-head comparisons of benzos and opioids versus floating. And we already have some studies that are looking at those particular things, but nothing has ever gone head-to-head against them. There was a recent study about meditation versus benzos and opioids. And that was a pretty exciting thing to see a holistic option that was being compared to big pharma options. And so that's one of the goals for the FRC is to really push that and to be able to compare head-to-head things like Xanax or OxyContin and how float therapy can provide those same benefits, but without all of the scary side effects or the addictive qualities. Although a lot of people do say that they're addictive to floating, but in a very positive way. We'll also have a medical committee who is working to lobby and advocate for floating as an acceptable medical treatment to get physicians to recognize that this is something they can recommend for their patients, but also eventually to get insurance coverage for that as well. Some countries have started looking at float therapy as an acceptable as an acceptable treatment, and that medical insurance will cover those costs for people. We're also looking to create a network for data collection across the globe where everyday people can come in and anonymously report their own experiences, and it will be guided in a way that can be recognized as clinical research and to be viewed by both the scientific and medical committees and communities as reliable, valid data. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can scan this QR code. You can also go to clinicalfloat.org. You'll see an option on there for the Float Research Collective. This is my page where I talk a little bit about my story about floating and where we're also raising funds. But within that page, you're going to see some really amazing presentations about float therapy. You'll also see, tons of information and lots of links to other pages too. So you can scan that, or like I said, go to clinicalfloat.org or send me a chat or a message later. I'll put my email address up later. You're welcome to message me, and I'm happy to send you any links that I talk about during this session today. Speaking of new resources, this is a really cool thing. Shane Stott was he is an author. He was a float tank manufacturer, and he just released a new documentary about float therapy. If you are even the least bit curious about floating, I highly recommend you take an hour and a half to go watch this video. It is available on YouTube. And in the documentary, we hear Shane's story. You'll hear research from Dr. Justin Feinstein. You'll also hear some really powerful stories about people who have used float therapy to overcome things, from PTSD, chronic pain, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, a lot of really amazing stories. And every time I watch this, I get completely emotional. It's amazing to see how beneficial and how floating really does change lives. Let me share a little link here. And
It's a real special treat to be able to come here and present to you, as my first audience actually, our first set of data with floating in people who suffer from clinical anxiety. This is an intervention which seems to affect both the body and the mind. And it's not just altering the way that people feel, but it's actually fundamentally altering the biology. Floating is enhancing mental wellness.
One of the things about mental disorders.
So that's a little tiny snippet from let me turn my video back on. That was a little tiny snippet from the documentary, and that piece was actually recorded there we go. That piece was actually recorded at a previous float conference. It was several years ago. And so Dr. Feinstein was talking about some, first-time data. There's now quite a bit out there. They have not only, finished that study, they've done several more. There have been other colleges and universities that have also done some studies about float therapy. And so there's so much research that is emerging and continuing to, kind of build the case. But be sure to watch that documentary if you can. It is a really amazing work that kind of talks about what floating is and how it helps people. I'm going to focus on the business side through the rest of the talk, but even just thinking about it, you can tell I get really excited just knowing what a major difference it makes for folks. So let's talk about float vessels. This is pretty similar to what I talked about last year, but the big thing to know is there are so many options out there for every budget and for every style, for whatever your needs are. Some of them are very hands-on devices that you need to do a little bit more work yourself. Some are fully automated. And of course, the price point will range greatly within those. Each one has different filtration systems, different features. And so you can really go down a rabbit hole when you're looking for a new float tank or just starting to explore these. But when floating first took off, most of them looked like this. You may have seen pictures of this. And if you Google sensory deprivation or float therapy, you'll probably still see some of these. And they are still produced and are still out on the market. They are a favorite by many, many people. Typically, the regular tank style will often have fewer features. So they're a lot more affordable. It's great if you want to test whether or not float therapy could be a thing in your market. There's also pods, which are very popular. These kind of have like a clamshell or an oversized tanning bed feel where you are pulling the lid down with the hydraulics. And it's probably the most popular style that you'll see out there right now. There are also cabins, which are kind of like a room within a room. Mine is a wave float room, which you can't really see inside, but it looks very similar to this. We have a glass door. Not all of them have solid doors. Ours is sort of a hybrid because the ceiling comes down in a sloping pattern. And so that's really great for air circulation and keeping that kind of fresh feeling and no humidity, not too much humidity or condensation. There are also open float pools. There are also open float pools that have partial walls. There's square versions of it. There are so many float tanks that are out there right now that you can really find something for everyone. There are some preconceived notions that people will say about having claustrophobia, and I can never do that. And so having options like this, like the open float tank, can really help to overcome those. At my center, most people who come in say, whoa, I didn't expect it to be so big. There's this preconceived notion that it's a tiny, tiny little box. And typically you can stretch your arms all the way out. You won't hit, head or feet. You can kind of have plenty of room to wiggle in anything that you choose. As far as packaging and pricing for what to expect for your services, if you decide to offer float therapy, generally speaking, floating will be priced anywhere between $60 and $90. Over the past couple of years, I have seen it creeping up into the higher end of that, of course, with all of the increases in supply and demand and expenses, all of those sorts of things. The average float cost before was probably around $69. Seems like these days everybody is mostly in that $75 range. So it can be pretty comparable to massage pricing. A lot of times centers will offer things like 3-packs or intro packages. And then of course, membership options too, that are going to range between $40 and $75 or so a month. Now, if your center offers multiple services, which if you're already existing now and maybe you have a salt cave or a dry salt therapy booth, something of that nature, doing same-day combinations, back-to-back services is a very popular thing. This is my center. The image on the left is the inside of our wave float cabins. Like I was saying before, they have that wave sloping ceiling pattern. You can control lights and music inside. I absolutely love these. Our guests love them. Everybody who comes in and are just so excited. It's kind of a unique look compared to what else is out there on the market. And then this the picture on the right is inside our our salt cave, which is kind of a treehouse inspired environment. Our halo generator is on the back side of that green wall, and it blasts all of the salt into the room itself. What you don't see is where the image from the salt cave where I'm standing to take the picture. We also have floating lounge chairs attached onto the wall at a higher level. We have some more benches that are around the room. We have what we call a moon pod, which is like a giant squishy bean bag that conforms to the shape of the body. And we have a lot of folks who will come in and do back-to-back services. We've also set up our membership so that the credits that they receive from membership can be used for either of these options. We also have infrared therapy too, and so they can use that in any way. For a same-day package, we charge $100 currently, so they do get a little bit of a discount to do that, but it's a pretty easy add-on. Floating is a little bit more labor intensive whenever it comes to cleaning and turning the rooms and preparing that space for guests, where it's a little bit easier for us on the salt cave. So we love to be able to add that on. Sometimes we'll have folks who come in to float with us, and we have an opening in the salt cave. And so it's really easy for us to ask them to hop in. Because people come in already for the salt cave as well, they might be a little nervous about floating. It's a great way to be able to take them through our space, let them see the float tanks, and then they're like, oh, that sounds really good. Like, I think I'll give that a try. And then oftentimes they'll go ahead and book their appointments. So it's really nice to have multiple services, especially those that complement each other so well. Our salt cave is a very relaxing space, but a lot of times people will go float and then they come in and they kind of integrate the restfulness of the float while they're in the salt cave. Lots of options there. So let's talk a little bit about construction. This is I don't want to say that it's a barrier to entry for a lot of folks, but it is sometimes a hurdle whenever you are getting started. Everything has to be salt-proof, waterproof, soundproof, and light-proof. So what that means is it is not a turnkey operation. You cannot just simply throw a shower and a float tank into a room and call it a day. You need to consider the cost of the tank itself. And just to give you some ideas, those base models of float tanks, you can buy used. There is a huge market for those. You can buy used float tanks anywhere between, say, $6,000 to $10,000 or $12,000 for the smaller tank style. And then it can go up. I think the most expensive tank I'm aware of is about $60,000. So there's something, again, to fit every budget. You have to consider plumbing costs. If you don't have the room already plumbed for a shower and for drainage, it's wonderful if you can just walk into the float room and hose down the walls and hose down the floor, because salt gets everywhere. It's magical. I don't know, sometimes whenever I walk in, how people got salt where they did. I will say that my center, with the setup that we have, is really unique, and it doesn't seem to be as big a problem as it is at other centers. We have a little changing area, and then you step into the shower, you take your shower, and then step directly into the float cabin from there. And so when people come back out, they're stepping into the shower pan so that salt doesn't get, drapes all across the room. So consider your plumbing. That can be a pretty huge cost. Electrical is also a big deal, because you don't want to have a lot of outlets in the room. Again, salt and water with an open outlet, but it also is a weakness for sound. And so you can have sound leaks coming through if you have a lot of outlets or holes in the wall or things of that nature. Soundproofing is a huge piece. And so whenever you're building out a space for float therapy, it's also a good idea to do something special with your walls, either stagger studs or double studs. The type of insulation that you use is going to be a little bit different as well. Again, everything needs to be salt proof, right down to what kind of nails and screws you select. If you're using tile in your shower, you want to make sure you've got epoxy grout and not something standard. So sometimes there's a little back and forth with your construction team to educate them. And if you want to learn about those things, I have some resources that I'm going to share in just a little bit about, all the places that you can go to find information about what you specifically need during the construction process. But the biggest thing is to know that everything needs to be saltwater safe and easy to get wet and to clean up. My center, we have concrete floors with an epoxy surface that they're painted this beautiful bright blue, and they hold up to all of that beautifully. Some places will do tack-on flooring. Some will do a marine grade flooring, and there's tons and tons of different options. Again, all of those are going to change your budget amount. But typically, if you're adding floating to an existing business, if you go on the lower end of the float tank side, if you go maybe some DIY, you can probably add one around $25,000 per tank. If you're adding one versus two, versus 3 or 4. I think the largest center that I'm aware of is Just Float in Pasadena, California, and they have 11. And there are, some float centers out there have one. Some are home-based businesses. Some, my place, we have 3 float tanks, and they're all the same cabin. A lot of places will purchase multiple styles, which is a great way to get people to come back in and try a different one. Maybe they like the cabin better than the pod or better than the tank. So it's really fun if you have different styles. But from my perspective, I love efficiency, and having 3 of the exact same thing. I don't have to educate people 3 different times on, what the difference, how to operate things, where the buttons are. My team knows how to run all of them the same way. They don't have to do anything different for that. It also means that when we're keeping spare parts on hand, that we have parts that fit any of our cabins. If you're thinking about how many tanks should you have, if you are an existing business and you already have a solid base, adding 1 is a good idea. Adding 2 is probably even better if you have the space for it. A lot of people, while they don't float together in the same tank, although there are some that allow that, but while they may not be floating together, they like to come together, especially if it's something new. And so friends or couples, sometimes we have groups that will come in. For us, we started with 3. That's all the space we had, and I wish we had room for the 4th. If we ever have another location, we will absolutely go for 4. What is also a really smart strategy is to start with one or two, but go ahead and prepare a second or a third room. And that way you can add in later and launch additional services if there's demand for it. I am super glad that we started with 3. That was much easier for us. But within about 2 years, we were really wishing we had a 4th tank. We have a lot of folks who just want to come in small groups. And then, we also we're staying full. So let's talk about some resources. First off, on my website, I have a page that has pretty much all the links that we've talked about today. So if you go to mindful with 2 L's.solutions/resources, you'll find some things in there that I've mentioned, as well as some other options. There are also a bunch of Facebook groups I highly recommend. The Float Collective is it's a little harder to get into the Float Collective. You need to be in the active process of building, not just like considering it. But there are, 3,000 or 4,000 of us in there across the globe, an amazingly supportive and helpful group. There's also a public group called Why We Float, and that's just where anyone can join and talk about, the benefits of floating for themselves, talk about, asking questions about floating, all of that sort of stuff. There's also a group that I run called the Halo Therapy Collective, and it is for all of us dry salt folks, but you're also welcome to, pop in there and ask some questions about floating too. If you have questions and you're still in that like really early stage, not quite ready for the Float Collective yet, but you want to learn a little bit more, you can post in the Halo Therapy Collective. And a lot of the folks that are in there also have both services at their center. So they're pretty knowledgeable. One that I forgot to put in here and I just thought about is the Float Tank Buy Sell Trade group. You can obviously do what it says, but you can start there and at least get a handle on all of the different manufacturers that are out there, all the different types, as well as what to expect when pricing a used float tank. Some I've seen in there have been brand new tanks where, folks weren't able to get their businesses started due to the pandemic or, just random life things. But oftentimes you can find a really great deal on some amazing tanks in there and just kind of start to get to know, what you don't know yet, really. Another 2 more websites that are wonderful, floattanksolutions.com. There's blog posts in there. There are training courses. You can buy construction packets on there that tell you everything you need to know about opening a float center. Some incredibly helpful information. They also offer apprenticeships. They do a Start a Center workshop every year at the Float Conference. My husband and I attended, my husband attended that one. I attended the rest of the conference and got a ton of wonderful information there. Float Conference is, my current project and absolutely love it. The Float Conference has actually been around for about 11 years, had some amazing folks who ran it before I got involved and will continue to run, after my involvement ends. But the Float Conference is a great place to go meet people, to hear about the research, to hear business topics. I usually present some kind of either marketing or training information to share with the community. It's also a great place. We have some wonderful vendors and sponsors who will come out and show, all of the latest and greatest equipment or services and things that are helpful on both sides of the business. Even if you don't plan to add floating to your business, it is really helpful to be there. I learn a lot every time and get resources that are helpful on the dry salt therapy side of things as well. There's just a sample, you can get data, state of the industry reports from Float Tank Solutions. They have information on there that will be really helpful if you're pulling together a business plan. Things like what is the average price per float? And, I talked about it in really big, high level terms. They talk about it in nitty gritty actual reports, and data that float center owners have shared out with the industry. You can get, information about how many tanks your center has. And another great resource is flotation.org. It is the Float Tank Association. The FTA also puts on a lot of educational webinars for the community. Some are for members only, some are for the public, and anybody can hop on. Art of the Float is the podcast that I help with. Dylan, Gloria, Drew, and I have a really great time sharing that. And we talk a lot about what it's like to run float operations. And then, of course, I sprinkle in a little bit on the Salt Cave side of things here and there. But we talk about marketing tips. We talk about customer service, sales, leadership. We have expert guests who come in who offer other services and modalities. all kinds of information that's going to be really helpful to you if you're considering floating or even if you're not. And my email address is kim@mindful.solutions. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to send an email. You can find my Facebook page, mindful.solutions, or Instagram as well. I'm not super active on those because I spend all of my time doing all of the other stuff and helping with the organizations that I'm involved with. But I do check messages and respond to things pretty frequently on there too. So you're welcome to find me. It was an absolute pleasure to be here today and to share some more information with you all. And I look forward to connecting with you soon. Stay salty.